Thank you so much for joining us for this panel, Moving Forward, Legitimacy, Procedural Justice, and Reconciliation. My name is Danneile Davis. I'm a field advisor here at the National Network for Safe Communities, and I'm joined by this esteemed panel. They'll have a chance to introduce themselves properly in a bit. But just for some framing on why we're all here today, I want to take us back to a panel that some of you may have attended yesterday, actually, on law enforcement and specifically strategic enforcement and what it takes to successfully reduce and prevent violence. What I really enjoyed is the panelists were all sharing their perspectives on what it takes to create buy-in for successful violence intervention. One of the attendees afterwards asked the question, okay, why? Why is it so important for you to build trust? Why is it necessary for public safety? And how does this address the history of race that starts all of these conversations and that pervades all of these discourses before we even get to any of the work? So I promise I didn't plant her there. It wasn't even my panel. But I think that she really asked the questions that frame really the day two of this conference. And this morning, we all had the opportunity to sit with some of that why. It was incredibly powerful, and I will not attempt to recreate it here. But I think that these questions of why building trust is so essential to public safety, these questions of why we need to acknowledge the harm of racialized policing and of the history that we have all faced together will be some of the topics that we explore today. And they also, I think with this panel here, allow us the opportunity to ask some further questions, specifically what does it actually mean to build trust and how do we do it? So with that, I will turn it over to our incredible panelists to briefly introduce themselves and some of their connection to this work today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ben Tucker, First Deputy Commissioner for the NYPD. So I'll just tell you up front that on this issue, I've been kind of living it. So part of my introduction just simply is my time in the business. I joined the NYPD 50 years ago, and this is my 50th year, November 21st, since I was sworn in as a trainee back in 1969. And so for background, just to have a sense of my context for how I think about these issues, and most importantly, what I want to speak to you about as we go through this is talk about where we were in the NYPD 5 years ago and where we are today, and I'll run through that for you. So good to be here.
Good morning. My name is Anthony Titus. I'm a sergeant with the Gary, Indiana Police Department. I've been there the last 27 years. Currently, I run the training division, and I am one of the PJ instructors. The reason I do this work now is because, as I was telling Chief, I feel like I'm at the end of my career, and I don't want officers to be what I was probably the first 25 years of my career. This is good work. It's needed work. The subject matter is clear and concise, and if we, as law enforcement, buy into it and do it, I think it extends careers.
Lou Dekmar, I just feel like a pup. I've only been in 42 years. 29 of those as police chief, and the whole notion of trust is something that we had to address in my community, which is almost half African American, and the historic racial issues that our police officers confront every day. And the challenge, I think, for law enforcement, for policing, is because they don't understand the history, they don't understand the anger, the hostility, the rage, the frustration that greets them, and so they go into these communities or they go address these calls without an understanding of that history, and they react in a way that confirms that anger, frustration, and suspicion. And to answer the broader question why trust is so important, trust doesn't buy you a pass as an institution. What it does is it buys you time. It buys you time to get the facts. It buys you time to demonstrate whether or not your officers acted appropriately. It buys you the time necessary, if they didn't, to address it in a way that not only builds but fosters the confidence that the community needs in its police department.
Hey, good morning. I'm Monica Bell, and I'm an associate professor of law and sociology at Yale. And I do a lot of qualitative empirical research in communities that have been historically marginalized. So some of the research I've done has been in Washington, D.C. with mothers there. I've done research in Baltimore, Maryland with youth, and also in Dallas, Texas, and in Boston. And I'm starting some research in South Carolina. And I come at these issues really trying to think from the perspective of the community, not so much about how to build trust between community and law enforcement, but how to ensure that these institutions, and not just law enforcement, but all the intersecting institutions, are behaving in a trustworthy fashion. So oftentimes we come at these issues trying to find something wrong with the way communities see the institutions instead of shining the light on the institutions that have historically engaged in a lot of problematic social control. And I also come at these issues as someone who grew up in a quote-unquote marginalized community in South Carolina, which is where I'm starting some work now. And so I think so essentially what I try to do is to incorporate some of the broad theoretical thinking that we use to talk about law enforcement and all these different theories, and shine a light on how people are directly affected by those theories.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Sierra-Arévalo. I'm an assistant professor at the Rutgers School of Criminal Justice. Some of my past work has focused on New Haven. I see some of my friends and colleagues who have been part of Project Longevity, which is a focused deterrent strategy to reduce gun violence. So that's kind of how I cut my teeth as a researcher, was that project. My other work focuses on police culture, also gun violence and legal cynicism, and gun violence kind of as a response to the lack of trust in dominant institutions that might otherwise provide for public safety. And so in contrast to some of my fellow panelists, I actually don't know a world without these conversations happening. I don't remember the 1990s. I was born in the 1990s. That's kind of to betray my own age a little bit. And so I have learned tremendously from law enforcement, from social service providers, from other researchers that do remember a time when these were not conversations that were happening, where this was a fantasy, where people were in crisis and it didn't really matter what you did. You had to do something. And we have thankfully moved past that in a lot of ways, and we're beginning to ask questions about the role of trust. And trust is very much something that is a necessary but not sufficient condition for keeping communities safe. It is one of many things that has to happen. So.
I fear I started a pass the mic situation, so we'll just leave these on this for now. Yeah. We'll guard this one. So one of the benefits of having our panel on day 2 is that by this point, people generally know what we do here at the National Network. So, of course, our portfolio in the group violence intervention, the intimate partner violence intervention, our international adaptations, and then our police community trust building work. What people may not know unless they have worked very closely with us is that one of the core principles of the National Network is enhanced legitimacy. This means that it is not just a programmatic component of one of our projects. The last panel, you all got to hear a bit about the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. Not exactly a pithy title, but great work. And that is, very important work to us, but enhancing legitimacy is something that's critical to all of the work that we do and weaves through all of our violence interventions. So I want to take a minute, because I think we've talked about this word or mentioned this word quite a bit over the past 2 days, and I want to take a moment to demystify it a little bit and explain what legitimacy actually means in this context, what we're talking about when we talk about a crisis of legitimacy between law enforcement and marginalized communities. And everyone here, of course, does great work on this, so I'll pick on you first, Monica, to just explain a bit more about how you speak about legitimacy and help clarify what that means in terms of historical harm and present-day legacy as well.
Yeah, great. One of the things that I left out of my introduction is that I've been doing a lot of writing around the idea of legal estrangement, which I draw as a comparison to the idea of legitimacy. But we can talk about that in some more detail. So essentially, the idea of legitimacy, as it's often discussed in rooms like this, is how the government can more effectively manage people by having them subjectively believe in, by having communities subjectively sort of believe in the government, and in this particular case, law enforcement. That's a really thin conception of what legitimacy is really supposed to be about. So another way of thinking about legitimacy is to build in an understanding of the historical harm and a recognition of where people are actually coming from and why they don't subjectively trust governing authorities, and then to sort of try to build a system in which there's a cohesiveness between government and community and all of the interlocking institutions. And so that's another way of thinking about legitimacy, which is that the goal isn't just to get people to obey. The goal is instead to build a solidaristic community, a community where people feel that institutions are actually working on their behalf, and that they have not just working on their behalf. To add a layer to that, they also have power over these institutions in meaningful ways, that they can actually contribute to governance meaningfully. So that's an alternative conception of legitimacy that we don't see talked about enough in rooms like this, and that's, I hope that's a helpful introduction.
I wish I had longer arms for this. That is very helpful. Thank you. And I'm wondering for some of the law enforcement in the room, Anthony, I'll be picking on you a bit since we worked together on the national initiative. As a procedural justice trainer, how do you explain legitimacy to people in your classes?
So what we talk about for law enforcement, one of the things I like to do in my training is to take each officer back to the day you raised your right hand and you took your oath. Your oath did not include how a person was to treat you. Your oath included the service you were to provide. Law enforcement has authority given by the state, given by the county, given by the town. People recognize the badge, they recognize the equipment, the uniform. But what makes us legitimate is the way we interact. We use the term when somebody's cool, right? She's legit, he's legit. That's what it means. So it's one interaction at a time. You walk away being legitimate in your authority, or you walk away being illegitimate. And that's all it is, how I treat you, because that's what's important. Since we're in a place of higher learning, you guys have done studies, and it shows that it doesn't really matter the outcome of the interaction with law enforcement. What matters is how it was treated, and that's legitimacy.
I can attest to that. I have gotten 2 speeding tickets and felt very differently about each one depending on the procedural justice of the officer. But is there anything, Deputy Commissioner, Chief, that you'd want to add to that?
Sure. I'm kind of close to where Anthony's assessment is. So let me just tell you a story. I'm going to tell you what I tell young cops. So NYPD has been, for the last 5 years, moving in a direction of enhanced legitimacy. And if we start with the stop and frisk challenges that the agency faced in the prior administration, where we ended up with almost 700,000 stops in 1 year, you get a sense that legitimacy was eroded and things were not going well here in New York City. So we moved, as I said, under a new administration, new commissioner under Bill Bratton. I came back because he asked if I had an interest in coming back. I watched what was happening here in New York while I was down in D.C. and didn't like what I saw. So since I've been back, I came back to run the training bureau for Bill, and then 9 months later, in the end of February November of 14, became the first deputy. In this role, one of the things that I get to do is speak with all the new sergeants, new lieutenants, new captains, but also get to speak with all the newly appointed police officers. And so what I say to them, Commissioner O'Neill speaks to them and talks about what he thinks is important for them to understand as they begin this new job, this new profession. I speak to them about discipline, because I handle that among other things, but I tell them this story, and I think this story is simple, but it says it all, and I call it a cautionary tale. So I'm driving home from work. This is many years ago when I worked at the Legal Bureau in NYPD. And I'm driving home. I'm on 5th Avenue and St. John's Place. I stop for the light in Brooklyn. And there's an officer standing on the corner against the building line, young officer in uniform. He looks like he's about 12 years old. And he's standing there. And there's a woman crossing the street, approaching him with a little boy in front of her. I assumed it was his mom. And the little boy's feet, when he touched the sidewalk and he looked up and he saw the cop standing against the building line, his eyes lit up. You could see this kid was, wow, sees this guy in uniform, and he's looking at the officer, and he's walking around in front of the officer, and the officer just stood there. He never moved. He never acknowledged the little guy. He could have done any number of things. He could have bent down. He could have smiled. He could have put his hat on his head, any number of things. But he didn't. He just, now I'm in my car having a fit because I'm watching this, evolve in like 40 seconds, 45 seconds. And so his mom, I assume it was his mom, took him by the hand, and they just walked down the street. She looked at the officer. She didn't say a word. She just looked at the officer and walked down the street toward the supermarket. And I thought that that's a missed opportunity, right? So when I think about legitimacy and what police are about, I tell these young cops, I said, that's a cautionary tale because you don't ever want to be that cop, right? You need to be, when you are in a community, in uniform, you are not occupying that space. You are one of the people in that community. You are part of the community. And so, and you can't, it's unavoidable. So if you walk a footpost, I walked a footpost as a young cop. And when you walk a footpost, you become part of that community. You're in a commercial strip, you're in a residential area, whatever it is. But to me, legitimacy begins with that notion of what you are. If you're engaged in law enforcement, you have to have that mindset that you start out that way. Yeah, you're there to keep the community safe, but you're a part of the community. And it goes to the larger issue about the notion of public safety and what it means to have a safe city. What it means is that it's a dual role. It's not just about law enforcement, it's about citizens, right? And the way that keep cities safe is we have citizens and police sharing the responsibility for how we do what we do. And so we all have our sort of social contract about how this is all supposed to work. But to me, that's sort of the baseline for what legitimacy really means.
Thank you. And Chief, is there anything you'd like to add?
All that, and the other thing, and this is the policymakers, the police chief, or somebody that is a part of command staff. It has to be more than training, and it has to be more than a discussion. It's got to be embraced in policy. It's got to be reinforced consistently in training. It's got to be monitored by supervisors that get it. There's got to be some mechanism for corrective action so that when you see something that occurs in a way inconsistent with the expectations of that community. And legitimacy is more than just the lawful authority. It's the community expectation. I catch myself, I say law enforcement sometimes. It's a term I really don't like because it doesn't define us. It's police services. Any agency, 10% of their calls for service or their citizen contacts result in an arrest, which means 90% of the time we resolve issues short of arrest. We mediate, we problem solve, we refer, we give a citation and release. So, unfortunately, the use of force narrative, which is rare, and deadly force rarer than that, we have something like 100 million contacts or calls for service a year. Of those, we arrest 11 to 12 million. Of those, we'll have 50,000 officers assaulted, 10,000 feloniously, and we'll take a life less than 1,000 times. But unfortunately, in those instances where that life has been taken and it was inappropriate, all the stuff that that agency has failed to do to legitimize the actions that they take come cascading down on them. And that's why, from a public safety standpoint and from as a policymaker, trust is the lubricant that allows communities to kind of knock the rough edges off and do those things that need to be done in a way that preserves not only trust, but the consequence of trust, which is public safety. In our agency, for 20 years, we've had mandatory recording. That is, every citizen contact has to be recorded. If it isn't, it's an 8-hour suspension. Everybody knows the first time. We got body cams 10 years ago. I'm still frustrated when I see folks that represent our profession take an opposing view of body cams. And why, pray tell, after an officer-involved shooting, you're not immediately releasing the body cams? I don't understand. They're going to be released eventually. There was a study done, looked at 3,000 complaints against police officers that were video recorded, 96.2%. 96.2%, the video acquitted the officer. The video memorializes those things that as policymakers we know. 95% of the time our officers get it right. And when we don't, we need to quickly get out there and then risk manage, not stonewall.
Great, thank you. And in talking about why it's important to have this trust, I think it's really important to understand the consequences for when there is mistrust. And Michael, you've done some really incredible research on gun carrying ownership in Chicago, and I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to some of that research and your findings.
So the paper that is being referenced was an outgrowth of some work by Tracy Mears, Andrew Papachristos on a survey of what they termed quote-unquote active offenders in Chicago, meaning that they had been released from incarceration and they continued to commit crimes as defined by their recidivism and being readmitted, I think, within 1 year of their release. And the survey covered a host of things, social networks, known associates, things of that nature, but it also asked some very particular questions about their gun carrying behavior, their gun ownership. And so I used those survey data along with some measures of their perceptions of police, of courts, of prosecutors, but I focused on police, to see if there was any relationship between your trust of law enforcement, your belief that they are able, willing, and equipped to provide for your safety, and your decision to possess a firearm specifically for protection. And as it turns out, when you live in a community and you do not trust the police to provide for your protection, to keep you safe, your desire to be safe doesn't go away. You are going to stay safe one way or another. And that can be for a variety of reasons. For some people, it's because they need to get to school. For others, it is because they are involved in criminal activity. The fact remains that people want to be safe, and they are going to stay safe one way or another. And so what the paper finds in the analysis is that those who view the police as less legitimate in this subsample of individuals in Chicago are significantly more likely to have gotten and possessed their most recent firearm specifically for protection. And so this is when I say that trust is a necessary but not sufficient condition for public safety. People want to be safe, and that is something that is consistent. It doesn't matter where you are. People want to be safe. Now, in some neighborhoods, being safe is a much more pressing concern than in others. but people are going to do what they need to do to be safe. Donald Black talks about this as self-help. Individuals will take measures to provide for themselves what the state is either unable, unwilling, or ill-equipped to provide for them. In this case, that is safety. And so in general, when we talk about the negative externalities of a lack of trust, and I'm sure the law enforcement individuals here can speak to this much more closely than I can, the phenomenon of stop snitching, the phenomenon of shutting out law enforcement from communities, it actively pushes away the institutions that presumably are those that should be able to solve certain kinds of problems, to clear homicides. And it results in a very vicious cycle of communities feeling over-policed and underprotected. The very people they want help from are the ones that they believe are also victimizing them. And the cycle, frankly, has gone a very long time and it is still going. But this kind of work is an avenue to begin to break down those barriers. It's an avenue to try and show communities that there is a way forward, there is a way to solve homicides, to enhance public safety without flooding communities with law enforcement, without putting people against walls, without disrespecting people, by embracing the tenets of things like procedural justice, while still holding firm on the notion that violence is unacceptable, it will not be tolerated, and there are consequences for hurting your community and for endangering yourself and others.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I want to revisit a little teaser, Monica, that you shared about your work in legal estrangement. And if you could speak to what the traditional frameworks of legitimacy and procedural justice don't quite capture about some of the toxicity that exists between marginalized communities and law enforcement, or police services, as you lent us
I like that,
Chief.
Police services. That's
Yeah.
good. So one of the things I really appreciate about this conversation is that like we have people on this panel who are doing very direct work with communities and direct work with law enforcement officials to get them to behave better. And we have this idea that if law enforcement officers have interactions that are procedurally just, and that will build all the trust that we're talking about. But one of the things I've found consistently in my research across several cities at this point is that people do report having procedurally just individual experiences with the police or with various police officers, but that doesn't build into a lack of legal cynicism or a lack of legal estrangement. They just sort of say, well, I had this one positive experience. So the question is, where do we go from there? And so this idea that I've been working on, legal estrangement, has essentially three components. One is to focus on kind of procedural justice. Procedural injustice is part of this conversation. So it's really important that we do the work of having police officers be trained well to not, beat in people's doors unnecessarily, put people against walls. That's really important work. But there are other layers. So the second layer I talk about in the work is vicarious marginalization, which is this idea that, we talk about, communities as if, a lot of times, I talk to people about my work and they're like, well, what about young African-American men between 18 and 25? Like, they're the people of importance in this conversation. And that's not true. They're not everyone in the community, right? They're heavily affected, but they're not everyone. So it's like, well, why do we care what mothers think about the police and law enforcement? It's like, well, we care because A, they're part of the community too, right? And B, because people are interacting. And so one of the things I found consistently in my research with mothers and with young women, for example, is that they talk about times of seeing other people have negative experiences. A cousin has a negative experience, a son, a brother. They themselves have one of a different sort, of not about necessarily use of force in some of the particular ways that we talk about, but essentially, because people interact so much, there's a vicarious experience, and this is also where the historical experience comes in, right? So vicarious experience is also the stories that people tell about, particularly, people like them. So especially in the research I do, African-American communities, it's like, well, this is the way police treat us. That has been true since slave patrols. Like, this is like what police do, and that is a lot to overcome, and that has to be acknowledged and dealt with in a direct manner in ways that procedural justice don't quite get to. And that kind of will lead into the reconciliation conversation. The third layer of the legal estrangement work is a focus on structural exclusion. And this is where conversations about democratic voice, segregation, all of these structural conditions come in. But unfortunately, a lot of times in rooms like this, people say, okay, well, if what you're saying is we need to solve poverty in order to do something about policing, then I don't know what kind of conversation we can have. But instead, I think a better way of thinking about this is to go back to this language of police services. It is true that in a day and time where crime rates are not at their height, we have these large police forces, we have institutions with resources in the government that could be marshaling those and using those in different ways in order to do the micro level work of rooting out some of the problems of, for example, segregation. So it is, there are ways that policing can be organized at a policy level, not necessarily at an individual level, to be cognizant of these structural issues and the poverty that people face, et cetera. So those are direct things, and so that's the kind of work that the legal estrangement framework would get you to.
Thank you, and that really does set us up perfect. Oh, yes, please. Thank you. That really does set us up perfectly to talk about answering one of those next questions about the how. So we recognize and we appreciate the importance of this work. So how do we do it? And as far as some of those promising practices, yes, procedural justice is a critical, necessary component of this work, but it is not the sum of good work. What we always talk about in framing the procedural justice work, at least with the National Initiative Project, which, as you all know, is a grant that under the U.S. Department of Justice that closed earlier this year, that procedural justice is important, but it is not the sum of all best practice policing, right? It's not sensitivity training, it's not diversity programming, it is something that is very powerful and very specific. So when we talk about promising practices to dismantle legal estrangement, to build trust, procedural justice is an important piece of that, and reconciliation as well. So I think we'll have time to talk about both of those, but starting with procedural justice, of course, when there is the example of the 2 traffic stops and the 2 tickets, right? It's not the outcome, but it's more so the process. But rather than delve into my own personal misfortunes, I'll give... Those are some big tickets. I mean, so I grew up in Florida, so I think my driving license actually says plus, 15 miles over. But anyway, I'll move past that. These are in different states, so just ignore that, Deputy Commissioner. I haven't driven in New York. You gotta slow down. Or take the train. So I think that my colleagues' panel yesterday, actually, on strategic enforcement did a great job of outlining PJ, precisely because they didn't actually say the word, right? So when they're talking about how they get buy-in for their violence interventions, one sergeant spoke to the need to ensure that the community informs the process and has some sort of input and that they feel heard. That's voice. That's one of the elements of procedural justice. We then heard that it's important to have very clear protocol and reasoning for why the strategy is set up the way that it is, so that it's clear that this is not racial profiling, that we're not claiming that somebody is involved in a gang just because of a hat they wear, how they wear their pants, but rather it's the specific protocol that their interactions and their actions need to meet, right? That's demonstrating neutrality, another element of procedural justice. One of my favorite was when they said, you have to explain what it is that you're doing and you have to follow up and keep your word. So one of the sergeants was saying that a community member just didn't believe him when he said that he would come back and follow through the specific action. He said, well, I have to do it, I just told you I would. And sure enough, he did. That's trustworthiness. And the fourth element of procedural justice is respect. It's respect for each member of the community, right? So that's the kind of overall framing of it. And there's plenty of literature about the impact of procedural justice in law enforcement, oftentimes in the courts as well. But I want to turn to the practitioners here with the real-world experience who live this every day. And I'm just wondering if I can hear from you in your experience how procedural justice has been effective in building trust and how you think it could even be more effective. I think Chief already tapped you first, Anthony, so by giving you the mic.
So speaking for the Gary Police Department, I will say our initial venture into PJ, I was one of the people in the room that I understood what it was, but I did not understand why we were getting it. The message to the PD, I didn't think it was demonstrated to us clearly why we needed PJ training. Some of the things that they were saying in PJ1, PJ2, we were doing. I did not think we were having the issues of Ferguson or these different places. And no offense. We had not had riots and burnings and demonstrations and all those things that I personally felt PJ was born out of. So it was not explained to us well why we had to sit through this training and learn how to talk to people, because we felt we knew how to talk to people. But that being said, I understood it, and it was good work. And so what saddened me in the room was it seemed like, and nobody gets offended, it seems like the heart of some of my fellow workers was stagnant. And when you have a stagnant heart, sometimes it's displayed outwardly, and you refuse to change. You refuse to see things differently. So we had to work past that and subsequent PJ1 trainings and PJ2 trainings and PJ3 trainings, where we would be met with officers sometimes that would say things like, "You don't want us to be safe," and you don't understand. And so at the time I was on a fugitive task force with the U.S. Marshals, so my day would start at 4 in the morning, depending on where I worked from, and we were actually kicking indoors. That was our job, because we were going after violent felons, murder warrants. So I had to explain to officers that I do this all day, but I do it legitimately. Your door's coming down, and when I put you in cuffs, that's it. So the trust begins when, again, you legitimately do your job. I have 2 teenage boys, my 2 youngest sons. And I don't know if they still say it, but years ago, teenagers would say something like, "You're on team try hard." And so I said, "What does that mean?" And they say, "You're overdoing it." And sometimes as cops, we see videos on CNN first thing in the morning, and we're like, "Oh my God, that cop overdid it," right? That's the truth. So now we have to deal with that. It may have happened here in New York. I'm 700 miles away. But we have to deal with that because we're all in the same profession, public service. So building trustworthiness is really one step at a time. It's one foot in front of the other. We talk about community deposits, community withdrawals. Well, historically, law enforcement has overdrawn our bank account with the community to a horrible state that it'll probably take, and this is good work, and we're making headway, but the hole we dug, I mean, we're still trying to fill that. And it's one good work at a time. That's how we're building trust. It's one good work at a time, because when you have those good interactions, that person that you interacted with becomes your voice in the community. You talked about building time, that trust builds time. That's that built-in time to get the information out. That's not that rush to judgment that we see in some communities when there's an officer-involved action. There's a rush to judgment. Automatically, officer was wrong. But when you've done those things and you've made those steps to build that trust, there are voices in the community that go, wait a minute, let's just see what the officers have to say. So that's how we're building trust. It is one step at a time. It is a continual work. It's a work you do when you're tired, when you're not tired, when you're happy, when you're sad, when you haven't had your coffee, when you need more coffee. You're still taking those steps and doing that work. And one thing about law enforcement, not to ramble on, but personally, we come into this job not aware of the history. We don't know that, as it's been saying, history stole our profession from us. For black officers, we don't know that we're Uncle Toms all of a sudden. And we get called far worse. But we don't know that because we took a job to support our family that now we're the enemy of our neighborhoods. We don't know. And I think it's great, Commissioner, that you do that when you talk to new officers about that, because we didn't get that. You know, I graduated police academy. My inspector showed up and congratulated me for joining the biggest, baddest gang in the city of Gary. And that's how we policed. That was, 27 years ago. That's how we policed. So I'm thankful now that later on in law enforcement, we're learning that, we're reformed gang members. Forgive us, because we didn't train this. So when I go teach this in the academy, I always tell the young officers, you're fortunate to get this training, because I think every officer, if there are any officers in the room, if you had this training in the academy, another tool in the toolbox, wait, I don't have to go hands-on, we can talk about this. And that's the type of thing that we really appreciate now, because it's helping us build trust. Coming in the door, hands-on may not be our first option. We can find common ground as human beings with each other, and communicate from that level, build trust, and go forward.
Thank you. And now you all can see why the national initiative did get results. So would anyone else like to respond to that?
So I just, when I think of legitimacy and procedural justice, the whole idea, I think, is I don't see them as linear. I don't see them as separate issues and conversations. The notion of the past, the reconciliation challenges that we face in law enforcement, all of these things are connected. And even the trust discussion is connected to not just building trust in community, but building trust in the agency. And it starts at the top with leadership. So, I'm at a point now, as I listen to the conversation, where I think in New York City, in the way in which we've approached this is a little bit different than the theoretical challenges that we face. But I tried to put in practice each of the lessons we learn about and know about in terms of what people expect, how they want to be treated, what respect looks like to citizens in their encounters with police. But you have to build that into the training. You have to use technology effectively to strengthen your capacity to interact with communities in ways that it matters. You have to change your law enforcement approach to how you identify those people in the community that are the lawbreakers and the most violent, and go after those folks and focus and target them, as opposed to the dragnet types of policing or the numbers-driven policing that police departments tend to get into, right? And so what we've tried to do is, and have done, is to really take it from that perspective, look at it through that lens. And the culture of the police department, and the NYPD in particular, has changed dramatically. And so we're starting to sort of break down some of the issues that have existed for decades in terms of how the agency does its business. But the key to it, to me, and as I think we've demonstrated, is about leadership. That is, everybody's on the same page about what's expected, what they expect, what we expect of them from where I sit as the deputy, the first deputy, and who the commissioner is, and the entire leadership team, and looking down through the agency all the way to the cops on the beat. And so we've tried to, over this last 5 years, move in the direction of bringing crime down to as low as it's ever been in the city's history. And use of force, I think Lou referenced it, is down to its lowest I mean, last year, we have 37,000 cops in New York City. Last year we had 35 times, only 35 times, occasions where police officers fired their weapons. This is after 5 million contacts, you know, in that year, interactions with our citizens. And half of those were adversarial. That is, the bad guys were shooting at us, and so forth. So the rest were accidental. There were we averaging 4 suicides a year, things like that. And then we shoot some dogs, not because we don't like dogs, but they are, you know, they get shot during execution of warrants, or sometimes they're attacking people on the streets when officers arrive, and so they get shot. But you know, that's a huge, you know, where we are didn't happen in just the past 5 years in this department, but it's been cumulative and been moving in the right direction. And we reached out initially on training to make sure that issues, we spoke to Tracy Mears, we spoke to Phil Goff, we brought in some of the best people on some of these issues, you know, in terms of bias and those kinds of things. So you have to think more comprehensively. If you have an agency and you're trying to right-size it and deal with and address some of the challenges that people are upset about, you have to really think about that. You have to be bold enough to invest in it in a way that it matters. And so if you do that, you end up, you know, not only keeping communities safe, and that's not to say that we're not by any means perfect. I mean, but crime is way down. So with the measure the way we're measured against the activity now is really against what are record low homicides in the city. In 1990, when you were born, who was it? Michael. When Michael was born, 2,245 people were murdered in New York City. 2,245 people were murdered. And half of those were, I mean, you know, when we dealt with the firearm discharges in 1972, just to give you some context there were 954 firearm discharges that year. But that was, you know, and half of those were adversarial, right? Today, last year we ended with under 300 homicides. The year before that we had 298 homicides. That's 298 or 300 too many. But when you think about, you know, the realities of our society, you know, people are violent to one another, toward one another. So that's, but the numbers matter. And so our index crime is as low as it's ever been, as I said. And we got here because we're much more precise. Our number, we arrested, by the way, 1 million fewer people. So we've been very strategic and thoughtful about how we go about policing this city. And the building trust aspect, you know, community engagement has been paramount, and we got there with basically relying on a shift to what we call neighborhood policing, which is a whole focus on realizing that if we change the way we first of all, we resected our precincts, the 77 precincts. We put cops in those precincts that only work in those commands when they come to work, because then they're much more familiar with the culture of the community, what's going on in the community, and so forth. We reorganized the way that they respond to radio runs, so we gave them 30% of their time off the radio, so that, you know, normally, you know, what you saw in New York City decade after decade was cops were chasing the radio. 911 call, you respond. The only time people saw them, the citizens in the respective communities, is when they're coming in to take action, to make an arrest, right? That sort of thing. Or aided cases, you know, we go to people's homes because people call us when they need help. Those kinds of things, you start to see, we start to see changes in the way in which we police. If under neighborhood policing, you now have officers who understand what's happening in the communities. You have neighborhood coordinating officers who are both focused on crime fighting, but also focused on community engagement. All of those things, structurally, when you move in that direction and you structurally change the way your patrol function operates, that makes a huge difference. And so those are just, you know, like little vignettes of what we've done to make those changes. In addition, we have a deputy commissioner now for collaborative policing. Collaborative policing has to do with really recognizing that there are times when we need to make sure that our interactions with other city agencies, because it's not just the police, bringing them to the table. We have, a victim's assistant now, 2 people who are advocates who are in precincts in every one of our 77 precincts to have that interaction to help people when they walk through the doors, give them answer their questions if they've been victimized and so forth. But what I'm suggesting is that you have to have a comprehensive approach to how you interact with community, but you also enlist the community's help in solving the problems that we're talking about. We recruited 800 people to be community partners, which were people, when you send new cops to a new assignment in a precinct right out of the academy, you now have citizens who live in those communities who educate them about the community, who give them a sense of what goes on, what the conditions are, and so forth. The community also every cop has a cell phone, so the communities will have the cell phone number of the neighborhood coordinating officer or the sector officers working in their communities. You close that communication gap. You use social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, to provide information and communicate with citizens that way. So all of those things, when I talk about it being much more comprehensive, the more you do those things, and the way it's worked with us is it's given us the ability to assess the trust level, and people seem to be responding well. We're evaluating it now, so we'll get a sense of just sort of where we are in terms of the impact, but anecdotally, everywhere I go in the city, you get a sense of, from people I speak with who, by the way, were not really partial to police and didn't like them very much, are realizing that, wow, these officers are trained differently, they're trained better, they do respond differently. It doesn't happen all the time, which is why we still have a disciplinary system, but even in that context, we changed the way we level the playing field, when I say build trust inside the agency, to make sure that the discipline process was fair and equitable as well. There's a legitimacy that goes along with that process. Because if you treat your cops fairly, even when they get in trouble, you hold them accountable and they move on with their lives. Or you terminate them because the conduct they engaged in was was required. But at least they know if you do this, there are consequences, and it's fair and it works out. That means when they go on patrol, they're not harboring any hard feelings about the way they've been treated by the department, and so we think that there's a real benefit that gets passed on to the way in which they interact with their citizens. So I just wanted to, I know I took a long time to kind of give you that, and this is only just a piece of what we've been doing, but the results, I think, speak volumes about getting it right in ways in which we know the past didn't reflect the way we operated. The present, we see very different results and very different reactions from the citizens, and a whole host of other things that we're doing, I think, that really speak to some of these issues in total. Not necessarily in this or that, or in a linear fashion, but in fact in a more comprehensive, more thoughtful connection, so that all of it taken together, you get better results. And the thing that never goes away is being painted with the same brush by the results or the events that take place elsewhere around the country. I mean, we have our Eric Garner case, the tragedy with Mr. Garner. When you have those incidents, it becomes a lightning rod for challenges, and that happened in the middle of 2014 at the same time as we began to see some more of these abhorrent shootings taking place across the country. And so I think it's tough for law enforcement agencies to step away from that. You can't. And what you have to do is, again, it goes to training, it goes to de-escalation training to make sure officers understand when they use deadly physical force and when they don't, having options like less than lethal force and so forth. All of those things matter.
Great, thank you. Yeah, sure. So I think, what you've laid out is so important, that comprehensive reform. And Jesse Janetta from Urban said in the earlier panel that you can't really build trust without that trustworthiness. And that takes what Chief laid out about the police departments as policymakers and as having the opportunity to really set the course within their department through policies and practices to transform how they engage with the community. I do want to revisit what we were talking about, especially with you, Monica, on recognizing the full breadth of these relationships, right? And procedural justice, I think, speaks very well to the interactions that we have in our police services capacity. But thinking more broadly about how we just restructure policing and reconceptualize public safety. And the idea of reconciliation, to do that, is hopefully what I'm thinking you speak to in your work about legal estrangement, to dismantle those boundaries and to foster inclusion. And two of the powerful elements of that are the acknowledgement of harm that people have that communities have faced, and a real substantive, meaningful commitment to creating that change. So at the National Network, in our reconciliation framework, we think that in order to create any sort of sincere and specific acknowledgement of harm, there must be a real understanding of that harm. So both historical and present, it's imperative to do that research to establish that record of truth. In the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions abroad, from which our framework draws, such as work in post-apartheid South Africa, Northern Ireland, the Middle East, that truth component is critical, because if we don't agree on what harms we're talking about, then we're not really on the same page about the diagnosis or the potential solutions. So understanding that harm, sincere and specific acknowledgement of that harm, leading into ongoing dialogue with the community through listening sessions, as we call them, that hope to inform meaningful policy and practice change within the department. So the idea is that we start by creating a kind of forum where the voices of community members are elevated, they're able to share their concerns and grievances. Oftentimes they don't have that space to do so. And then sort of transforming into more of a collaborative public safety partnership where there's an ongoing dialogue where community members and police departments can talk to each other. And throughout this process, we learn of the narratives from law enforcement, from community members. And look, we're all human, right? You know, outside the suits and everything. We connect with each other on stories, we build empathy by understanding each other as people. And it's not, each of these components on their own is not enough, right? Understanding the truth is nothing if you don't do anything about it, right? Sharing the stories and asking people to delve into their own trauma to share these stories means nothing if you don't use it for real reform and real change. So I want to talk a bit about what that reconciliation process looks like, and particularly that acknowledgement of harm piece with some of the people here who've done it. And Chief Dekmar, you, in your work, your leadership of IACP as past president, and then, of course, in LaGrange, you've done incredible work with this piece. And I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more to that.
Sure. Just on that last point, these guys, I think, did a great job of explaining, you know, where police is involving. And in my opinion, if I was academically inclined, I would study this and publish a paper. But I think law enforcement is looking at its third evolution. The first being sometime around the Wickersham Commission when they were trying to eradicate political patronage from policing. The next would have been the Presidential Commission on Crime in '65 because of Miranda Escobedo, Enrique Galt, the litany of cases and the suppression of evidence and the outrage by the public resulted in training, more professional policing, kind of the dragnet Adam 12, just the facts, ma'am. We're the professionals and we push the community away. And I think the third is going to be a recognition that policing is in the best position to be the ombudsman for social problems. We deal with mental illness, we deal with homelessness, we deal with prison reentry, we deal with educational disparity, we deal with unemployment. And recognizing that 3 or 4 years ago, and I've got under 100 officers, I took an officer position and turned it into a caseworker position. Because our officers know these folks need help, they just don't have the time to get them there. And so they refer them by report and email to our caseworker, who is a police officer, but she's got contacts with over 70 nonprofits and other government entities in the faith community, and they'll make a referral and she'll plug them in. And as a result, rather than just showing up and addressing these problems in a linear fashion where you're going to the same place over and over again until you end up with a bad outcome, which the mental illness piece is a large part of that. New York City is, I think, number 3 in providing us the 3rd largest mental institution, Rikers Island. LA County is the 1st, 17,000 inmates, over 5,000 in the mental health unit. What we've done to mental illness is criminalize it, and by default, we've had to deal with it. So I think our opportunity is to become the ombudsman and use the bully pulpit to bring political recognition and financing to these social issues because they become public safety issues. So I think that's where we're headed, and I think we can play a very important role, seeing how 90% of our calls are dealing with those issues. With regard to the acknowledgement and apology, and I intentionally do not refer to it as reconciliation because I challenge anyone to show me at any point we had a conciliatory relationship between the police and people of color. It doesn't exist. I like to refer to it as trust building. And in our jurisdiction, we had the police department that was involved in a lynching, and I didn't realize it until one of my captains came in and she said, "You're not going to believe what I heard in the hallway." And like most police departments are, we've got historical pictures of the old timers that served decades ago, and African-American woman, elderly woman, 2 elderly women, pointed to one of the pictures and whispered to one another as she passed by, "They killed our people." And I asked her, I said, "What are they talking about?" She goes, "I have no idea." And she's African-American. She said, "I have no idea." So I started doing research, and I found in 1940 that the police department had arrested a young man for assault on a white woman, which in Georgia in 1940 could be anything from a physical attack to failing to avert your eyes when you pass a white woman on the street. Found no official report. I found a small clipping in the local paper. I think it was on page 6, but it was covered extensively by New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, because at that time they were trying to get a federal anti-lynching law, and they showcased that. But it was stalled because of Southern Democrat senators who successfully defeated the bill. Anyway, they arrested Austin. Austin Calloway is his name. They arrested Austin, took him to jail, and within 5 hours, 6 folks with hoods showed up with guns and physically took him from the police. Now, this should be probably, arguably, the safest place in the world. And they took him from the police, took him out in the county, and shot him half a dozen times. When I recognized, struggled for a couple of years, I had to deal with this. Whites that I talked to said, you're just going to open up wounds. And I would say, well, I would argue those wounds are still open if I got little old ladies talking about it at the police department and pointing to pictures. Blacks' response was, well, this is just another hollow effort to, gloss over centuries of cruelty. But to both, my response is the institution and the officers that serve that institution are still here, and they carry the burden of that history. And so we can either ignore it and pretend nobody's talking about it, and nobody was in the white community, but everybody in the black community knew about it, or we can address it head on. And the acknowledgement aspect is just the first step. That begins the discussion. But what it does is it acknowledges, and it's institutional relationships, in my opinion, are no different than personal relationships. If I do somebody wrong and I come back a couple of years later and say, hey, I'd like you to work with me on something, they're not going to have a thing to do with me. But if I come and I say, hey, a couple of years ago, I was wrong, I shouldn't have done that, I apologize, and I can assure you it'll never happen again, they're going to be more open. This nation, if nothing else, is a very forgiving nation when people own up. They'll offer reasons why you did what you did. But if you don't own up, and in my opinion, any leader of an institution that has a history, the nature of leadership is to acknowledge that history so you can start moving forward. So when we decided to do that, and I contacted, saw the NAACP president, just asked him if he'd be willing to work with me on it, immediately said yes. We had historically frisky relationships. College president, mayor, state court judge, the pastor of the church where this young man had his funeral. And as a result of doing that, it's opened up all sorts of opportunities. When I first came there as police chief, we had areas in town where when the police cars drove through, they throw bricks and pieces of concrete at the police department or at the police cars. So we've come from there 25 years ago to after we did the acknowledgement and started working on record restriction, homelessness, mental illness, prison reentry. We wanted to tackle the disparity of education. And so they asked if I could arrange a meeting with the school board president and the superintendent. And I said, well, I think they would meet with me. So I told them, this group that I've been working with like to meet with them. They agreed. We had a meeting and agreed to a future meeting. And they said, well, we'll have a meeting here at this place and time. And one of the folks from the NAACP said, no, we want to have a neutral place. Let's go to the police department. Which I thought, coming full circle, and I took a room that we use for training and turned it into a community room, and we have people meeting there. Those are, I think, the importance of recognizing that the institution has done wrong and acknowledging it lays the potential path for working together on the things that matter. But it's a hard conversation, but as one of the pastors working with us said, if you're going to be a bridge, then don't be surprised if you're walked on. And so that's the nature of this work. The officers, when I told them we have an annual inspection, which I'm sure most agencies do, and so I told the commanders, I said, gather them around. I said, I want to talk to them. And I told them that, I decided to do this. I wasn't so married to it that I couldn't change my mind, but I'd have to hear something pretty persuasive. And I reminded him of Tuskegee, less than an hour from us, where we had the Tuskegee experiments from 1929 to 1972. I reminded him that of the 128 counties at the time, in Georgia, that our county was number 5 in the number of slaves. I reminded him of the black codes. I reminded him of the Austin Callaway lynching. And I said, now, I don't know how we ignore that history. And typically, officers didn't say anything. But as I left, I had several that texted me and said, you're doing the right thing. And so I can tell you from personal experience and the way that was received when I became IACP president, starting some sort of international initiative, because this isn't unique to the United States. Pull up the polls in Canada for public confidence in police. It'll run similar to here, 50, 60% confidence level. You get into what they call the indigenous population, the native population, half or less, much like our African American poll results if we dig beyond the general poll. Same in Israel. Same in UK. So when I was going around the world talking about this initiative, it resonated through those folks that are involved in democratic policing. And so we picked 4 jurisdictions: Albany, New York, Ferguson, Missouri, Sacramento, California, and Fort Morgan, Colorado. And it was in Ferguson where a woman asked me this question, and I immediately went back and shared, I think Dan Branch is his name, wrote Parting the Waters on the civil rights movement. And I had my training guy read it and outline all the things law enforcement and policing did wrong, and that became part of our curriculum for our officers along with our local stuff, because she asked this question: why don't officers know the history? Why don't officers? Because when they get greeted with that anger and frustration, they don't understand it, and they react in a way that just compounds that relationship, that poor relationship. So that in a nutshell is what we're doing. We're working with those 4 communities. We've rolled out toolkits. John Jay College and the network has agreed to work with IACP and Georgia Chiefs Association. I approached 10 chiefs in Georgia and said, would you agree to pilot an initiative and on trust building? And they agreed to do that. And so we're going to have our kickoff in August. And their job is to get their elected officials there, somebody from the faith community, some community organizer or civil rights group, and business, and have them come, and we'll do a day of panels much like this, explaining the harm except for victims. And then the second day will be germane to those communities that are going to engage in this. So that's kind of a quick overview.
Great, thank you. And yes, please. So I have one last piece I want to talk about. I want to be able to leave time for you all to ask a question or two and hopefully eat as well. But I think so much in this work, when we talk about building trust, we very much, and necessarily so, talk about the issues and the history of race. And it's critical to speak to that. But I sit before you all as a black woman, and I can guarantee that my experiences are not, and my experiences with marginalization are not exclusive to my race. And I think we can all consider the various ways in which communities have been marginalized. And I think right here in New York City, this month being Pride Month, and the commissioner very notably acknowledged the harm of police actions during and leading up to the Stonewall incident. And I would just love to hear a bit from you, Acting Commissioner, on that apology and what led up to it.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's in much the same way that you've had this awakening. I think, you know, you have to pick the moment when you realize that, and it's about just telling the truth, but you have to pick the moment when you realize that you need to tell the truth. You need to acknowledge that something went wrong, and that and in this history, this is the Stonewall riots that took place. This is 50 years ago now, 69, and Commissioner O'Neill is, you know, some people in the room may know him or have seen him. I mean, he has a particular perspective on policing. He's been a cop for 36 years, and he'll tell you that right away. But he, you know, I think working with him is you get a sense that he thinks deeply about these issues, as did Bratton. I mean, we talked about race. We started a conversation about race in Commissioner Bratton's administration when he came back, and we had a deep discussion about that in the context of not just externally, but also internal to the department and the culture that we knew was there. I think Commissioner O'Neill decided, I know he decided that on the issue of admitting that what happened in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn was outrageous. And so he wanted to, in his view, and he thought, he didn't think about it very long. I think he just decided at some point that he was going to make the announcement and the acknowledgement, and we did it at the opening of, you know, the Pride conference that we held at One Police Plaza a week and a half ago, a couple of weeks ago now. And I think, you know, the idea of how you interact with our various communities. That's the LGBTQ community. We have members in our department, Goal, we have, and there's been this evolution of acknowledgement and coming to grips with the fact that we all are individuals and we should be respected for who we are, no matter what the reasons are. And so it seemed to be, and I think he thought it seemed to be the right moment to make that comment and to express his view correctly so. I mean, he didn't get any pushback from anyone that I know of. I have my phone lit up. I have a whole ton of texts and emails from colleagues and friends saying, wow, damn. And on and on and on. I can't share them all with you, but they were, I mean, people were effusive about the fact that, first of all, that it was coming out of NYPD from the Irish Catholic bald commissioner, you know, and so, you know, it just it's I think in many ways it was you know, that's one of the issues was people was sort of beside, they said wow, this is amazing that the police commissioner of New York City made this comment and went public with it in a way. So and he would just say, listen, I thought it was the right time, and I thought it was the right thing to say because I believe it. And so that, I mean, that's very often, it's not rocket science, it's not complicated, it's very often what we should do is just do the right thing. And I think we manage the agency in that context, in that way. We're trying to do it, get it right, and do it right. One important point, Lou, you left out in your chronology, your historic chronology, was in '68 with all the riots that took place in light of the assassinations that took place that year. That is a huge issue because it's still alive and well. I mean, the history there, if you look at some of our cities, many cities have recovered, but a number of them haven't yet gotten there. So if you look at Chicago and you look at Baltimore and you look at Oakland, New York, we went through it as well, but we've been fortunate enough to be able to recover in many ways. But those challenges, so it's not, it becomes, you know, and that was a race issue for sure. You know, I mean, you think of Dr. King and others, but also, you know, Senator Kennedy and so forth. So those were all sort of things that happened and have historic significance and are connected to where we are today, for real. And we can't forget that. And our cops need to know that. The history is important. We take our cops, every class that graduates from the police academy now, before they graduate, I take them to the museum, the 9/11 museum, because they were babies, these cops, if they were born at all. But I take them to the 9/11 museum because they need to know the history, right? Our cops get trained. We spoke to the library, work with the library system in the city to train new cops about what's happening in the communities where they work. What's the history there? If you're working in the 7-9 precinct, 7-7 precinct in Brooklyn, Weeksville is there. You know, they need to understand and have some sense of what their connection is to, and understand who lives there, why they live there, how they came to be there, kind of thing. So those are the kinds of things that I think are related to and lead up to a commissioner of the NYPD in 2019 being able to say, we're sorry for what happened at Stonewall.
Thank you so much. And I think we have time for maybe one question. So are there any other mics around, or does anyone be able to ask? Okay, I think I saw your hand first in the back.
You discussed the collaborative training and the reduction, I don't usually need a mic, in homicides. Have you also seen in your data keeping a correlation in communities' willingness to assist in investigations and prosecutions of these crimes that are plaguing our neighborhoods?
Well, we do actually. Yeah, we get. I think that's one of the byproducts of, I think, the relationship we have in terms of the community engagement piece. We do have a lot of cooperation, more than you'd ever expect, in fact, in solving not just homicides, but shootings. I mean, we get calls. That's another an indicator of trust, I think, where people understand that what we're trying to do and what we do pretty well is catch bad guys that commit these shootings and these homicides. I attended a homicide. There's a homicide support group up in the Bronx, and run by Safe Horizon and the Bronx DA's office. And these are folks that I've known for years, some of them. But they invited me to come. I said, I want to come. And I sat, and these were all women who lost either brothers, husbands, children to shootings, to the violence in the city. And I sat through that session. It was a little uncomfortable because I'm walking into their private space to hear, what is on their minds. But that matters to me. It made a difference. I sat, I listened, and was able to, hear their grief and feel it. It was palpable. But for me, as a policymaker, as someone in the agency who looks at and investigates all our firearm discharges, who is responsible for looking at that realm of what we do, and also working closely with our detective bureau on these investigations. And we get incredible information from citizens all the time that help us. It's augmented by video. The cameras that we have access to, is at least 20,000 of them throughout the city. Some are ours, some are public and private buildings and so forth. But we get all this information, and we get them by debriefing people who have been arrested. Prisoners will tell you. It's amazing. If you ask them, they'll tell you. They'll give you information. So we get, I think, incredible cooperation from citizens. People will call Crime Stoppers, and they'll give us information which help us investigate and solve crimes. The fact that our cameras, the body-worn cameras, we now have 20,000 of our officers wearing body-worn cameras. In the next couple of months, they'll be up to 24,000, including, that's pretty much everyone who has anything to do with patrolling the city. We started doing that in 2017, and here we are 2 years later. And it makes a difference. But it makes a difference in a variety of ways in terms of the behavior, that it changes citizens' behavior and the cops' behavior, but it also provides information as these officers respond to shootings. Those cameras pick up people in the background, and it helps our investigators because it's often gang violence that's taking place. And that is just another bit of information that we share with district attorneys when we make arrests. So. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing those results probably perhaps much more than I think we would have in another or prior administration.
Thank you. And I would love to have, more questions. I would love to ask a few more of my own. I don't think I'm allowed to. So at this point, I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists, and a round of applause for them, please. So just to leave you all with this, I think that, we talk a lot about how the system is broken and how communities of color, how the LGBTQ community, how so many communities are marginalized by the system that's broken. But in reality, it's not. It functions as it was designed, which was to oppress those communities. And I'm so grateful to the work of our esteemed panelists here to dismantle that system and to create something better for all of us and for safer communities. So just another round of applause. Thank you so much.